March 19, 2024. The call came in at 2:47 p.m. Alaska time. Mountain Rescue received a report that would rewrite a decades-old mystery. A climbing team had discovered aircraft wreckage on an unnamed peak, 8,400 feet above sea level. The tail number was still visible through the ice, N847BX. That number had been missing from aviation records since March 14, 1989. For 35 years, families had wondered. Search teams had given up. Insurance companies had paid out millions. The disappearance of North Star Oil's charter flight had become Alaska's most enduring aviation mystery. But what the climbers found in that frozen wreckage would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple crash. The discovery included $2 million in cash, perfectly preserved documents, and evidence that would transform a tragedy into a criminal investigation. Captain David Brennan had been flying Alaska's challenging routes for 22 years. At 47, he was known for two things: his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering integrity. David never cut corners, his widow Sarah would later tell investigators. He treated every flight like his family was on board. The morning of March 14, 1989, started like hundreds before it. Weather reports showed a storm system moving through, but nothing unusual for March in Alaska. The flight was scheduled as a routine charter, 5 executives from North Star Oil heading to inspect a potential drilling site. At 6 a.m., Brennan arrived at Anchorage's private terminal. Security logs would later confirm his entry time, 6:03 a.m. precisely. He began his standard pre-flight inspection, checking every system methodically. His logbook, recovered 35 years later, showed normal readings across all instruments. At 6:35 a.m., another arrival was logged at the security gate. James Keller, everyone called him Jim, North Star's Vice President of Operations. Jim Keller had arranged this charter personally. He and Brennan went back 20 years to their days in the Air Force. Jim was more than a client, Sarah Brennan would recall. They grew up in the same neighborhood. David was best man at Jim's wedding. The security footage from that morning, grainy and deteriorated, would become crucial evidence decades later. It showed Keller arriving with an unusual amount of luggage, 3 large cases and a distinctive canvas bag with a monogrammed K on the side. At 6:47 a.m., something unexpected happened. The logbook showed a last-minute addition to the cargo manifest. Keller had brought what he called additional geological equipment. Brennan noted the time and the weight adjustment needed for fuel calculations. Marcus Holloway arrived at 7:15 a.m. As CEO of North Star Oil, Holloway commanded attention. 52 years old, aggressive in business, he'd built North Star from a small Alaska operation into a regional powerhouse. But archived financial records would later reveal a different story. North Star was drowning in debt. Holloway was 72 hours away from bankruptcy proceedings. Marcus seemed different that morning, a terminal employee would later testify. Usually he was all energy, shaking hands, making jokes. That day, he barely spoke. Elena Vasquez arrived separately at 7:30 a.m. North Star's chief legal officer, 38, Harvard-educated, she handled the company's most sensitive negotiations. She carried a locked briefcase that she wouldn't let anyone else touch, the briefcase that would never be found in the wreckage. Elena was brilliant, a former colleague remembered. She could find legal pathways through anything. Some said she was too clever for her own good. 2 other executives completed the passenger list, names that would fade from the investigation as attention focused on the key players. At 7:38 a.m., Keller signed the fuel receipt. This timestamp would later prove significant. The control tower logged takeoff at 7:42 a.m., 4 minutes to get from the fuel desk to an airborne aircraft across the facility, a detail that wouldn't be questioned for 35 years. The flight plan was straightforward: north from Anchorage, around Denali, then west to the proposed drilling site. Total flight time, 3 hours and 15 minutes. Weather reports indicated a storm system 40 miles south of their route. Brennan had flown through worse. At 11:23 a.m., the aircraft disappeared from radar. The last communication was routine. Brennan reported his position. Altitude normal, no problems. Then nothing. Search and rescue launched immediately. The storm had moved in faster than predicted, they said. Visibility was 0. After 2 weeks of searching, the official report concluded the obvious. The plane had likely crashed in the storm, somewhere in thousands of square miles of wilderness. But one detail didn't fit. The last radar position put the aircraft 73 miles off course, east, not west, away from the drilling site, away from the storm, into an area of unnamed peaks where no flight plan would ever venture. 3 days before the flight, something happened that wouldn't be discovered until 2024. Sarah Brennan had never opened her husband's home safe. It felt like violating his privacy, she explained, even after all these years. But the discovery of the wreckage changed everything. Inside the safe, investigators found photocopied documents. Documents from North Star Oil. Documents that Brennan had apparently copied during a previous charter flight on March 11th, just 3 days before his final flight. The papers revealed a land transaction. North Star was acquiring drilling rights from an indigenous Alaska corporation. The official price, $2 million. But the photocopies showed something else. Original valuations put the land at $18 million. Someone had altered the assessments. The indigenous corporation was being cheated out of $16 million. The documents bore Elena Vasquez's signature. There was also a handwritten note in Brennan's careful script. Insurance policy if anything happens. 7 days before the flight, March 7, 1989, Jim Keller had visited the Brennan home. Sarah remembered it clearly because it was unusual. Jim and David usually met at the airport or grabbed coffee downtown. Him coming to the house was rare. The conversation that evening seemed normal enough. Jim mentioned a big promotion coming his way. The Alaska deal, he called it. If this land acquisition went through, he'd finally make senior vice president. Jim seemed stressed, Sarah recalled. He asked to borrow $5,000, said it was temporary, just a cash flow issue. David gave it to him without hesitation. That's the kind of friend he was. But there was something else, something Sarah wouldn't think significant until investigators asked the right questions 35 years later. Jim asked about David's flight schedule, specifically about the March 14th charter. He wanted to make sure David would be the pilot. Said the executives were particular, they wanted the best. David was flattered. The morning routine. The ground crew that morning followed standard procedures. They loaded luggage under Keller's supervision. One crew member, an aviation photography enthusiast, took pictures of every charter flight. It was a hobby, documenting the private jets and their wealthy passengers. That roll of film would sit undeveloped in company archives until 2024. When finally processed, one image stood out. It showed Keller loading luggage at 6:43 a.m. Clear as day, despite the age of the film, was that distinctive canvas bag with the monogrammed K. The same bag that would be found in the wreckage, containing something that had no business being on a passenger flight. The pre-flight check continued normally. Brennan was thorough, as always. The cockpit voice recorder, when recovered, would reveal routine communications for the first segment of the flight. Weather updates, position reports. Then, at approximately 10:45 a.m., something changed. The recorder captured Brennan's voice, tight with tension. Rerouting for documentation. No explanation, no distress call, just that cryptic phrase. 38 minutes later, all communication ceased. The $2 million found in the wreckage raised immediate questions. Company records from 1989 listed the cash as payment for equipment purchases at the drilling site. Standard practice, North Star claimed, in remote locations where electronic transfers weren't possible. But federal investigators in 2024 would uncover a different story. Bank records, preserved under financial regulations, showed the withdrawal came from an account labeled Indigenous Settlement Fund. The exact amount that should have gone to the land rights sellers. The exact amount that never reached them. The money was packed in waterproof cases, serial numbers sequential, withdrawal dated March 13, 1989, one day before the flight. Marcus Holloway had personally authorized the withdrawal. The authorization email recovered from backup servers that North Star never knew existed carried the subject line, "Final Payment Protocol as discussed." But Holloway would claim complete ignorance about cash on the plane. His statement to investigators in 1989 insisted the flight carried only standard business documents and minimal expense funds. Someone was lying. The investigation that began in March 2024 faced a unique challenge. How do you solve a case where the primary evidence has been frozen for 35 years? Where most witnesses have aged, moved, or passed away? Where corporate records have been through multiple mergers and acquisitions? Detective Rachel Martinez, leading the cold case unit, started with what they had: the physical evidence from the crash site and a timeline that didn't add up. The first thing that struck us, Martinez would later explain, was the condition of the cockpit voice recorder. The damage pattern wasn't consistent with impact. Our audio forensics expert was certain someone had deliberately damaged the recording mechanism before the crash occurred. This raised an immediate question. Who had access to the cockpit? Who could have tampered with critical equipment without being noticed? The security footage from 1989, digitally enhanced with modern technology, provided the first clue. That 25-minute window between Jim Keller's arrival at 6:35 a.m. and his official check-in at 7 a.m. 25 minutes where his whereabouts couldn't be verified. Keller knew that aircraft, a former North Star mechanic testified. He wasn't just an executive. He'd been a navigator in the Air Force. He knew exactly where every system was located. The financial motive Marcus Holloway became the primary focus initially. The financial evidence was overwhelming. North Star Oil was 3 days from bankruptcy when the plane disappeared. The insurance payout, $47 million, saved the company. Holloway personally received a $4.7 million consulting fee 6 months after the incident. Bank records revealed more. 2 years after the tragedy, Holloway sold North Star for $89 million. From near bankruptcy to a fortune, all triggered by an insurance event. The motive was obvious, Detective Martinez noted. Too obvious, perhaps. Investigators discovered an email chain from March 1989. Holloway was desperate, seeking loans, selling assets, trying anything to keep North Star afloat. But one detail stood out. On March 12th, 2 days before the flight, Holloway had written to his attorney, "May have found a solution to our cash flow problem. We'll update after Alaska trip." The Alaska trip he would never complete. Elena Vasquez presented a different kind of motive. The falsified land documents put her in serious legal jeopardy. If the fraud was discovered, she faced 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The Indigenous Corporation was already asking questions. Their lawsuit, filed March 1, 1989, demanded a full audit of the land valuation. Elena was brilliant but cornered, a former Department of Justice attorney observed. The falsified assessments had her signature. She couldn't claim ignorance. She'd altered those documents to save North Star $16 million. Digital forensics made a breakthrough in week 3 of the investigation. Technicians recovered Vasquez's personal computer files from a corporate archive drive, data that North Star never knew still existed. Hidden in encrypted folders was an email sent March 13, 1989, at 11:47 p.m. The recipient's address was scrambled, but the message was clear. Brennan problem solved after tomorrow, 18 hours before takeoff. The weather lie. The official 1989 report blamed weather for the tragedy. A sudden storm, they said, unavoidable. But declassified satellite data from 2019 told a different story. There was no storm at the crash site, meteorologist Dr. James Park confirmed. The weather system was 40 miles south. The crash location had clear conditions, maybe some cloud cover, but nothing that would challenge an experienced pilot. This revelation transformed the investigation. If weather didn't cause the crash, what did? And why did the aircraft deviate 73 miles from its flight plan? Captain Brennan's recovered logbook provided a partial answer. His weather monitoring records, meticulously maintained, showed he was tracking the storm's position. He knew exactly where it was. The deviation wasn't to avoid weather. It was deliberate. Brennan flew to that specific location for a reason, Martinez concluded. He was trying to document something, or perhaps trying to prevent something. The helper's role. Throughout the 1989 investigation, Jim Keller had been the helpful witness. He provided detailed statements about Holloway's financial desperation. He revealed Vasquez's legal vulnerabilities. He was the grieving friend who'd lost his childhood companion. Jim was invaluable, read a 1989 investigator's note. Without his cooperation, we'd have had nothing. But the 2024 investigation saw patterns the original missed. Every piece of evidence Keller provided pointed away from himself. Every helpful detail directed suspicion toward others. The enhanced security footage revealed more. In those crucial 25 minutes, Keller had made 3 trips between his vehicle and the aircraft. 3 trips for what he claimed was 1 bag of geological equipment. Sarah Brennan remembered something else. After David disappeared, Jim was so helpful. He managed all the insurance paperwork, dealt with the investigators, even helped me financially. He said it's what David would have wanted. Bank records from 1989 showed Keller received an $85,000 deposit 3 days after the plane was declared lost. The source was listed as HMI Consulting. Corporate archaeology, the modern practice of tracing defunct companies, revealed HMI Consulting was a shell company. Its only transaction was that payment to Keller. Its sole owner, hidden behind 3 layers of corporate structure, was Marcus Holloway. But Holloway claimed he'd never heard of HMI Consulting. The altimeter discovery. The canvas bag with the monogrammed K found in the wreckage contained something extraordinary. Tools for adjusting aircraft altimeters. Specialized equipment that had no legitimate reason to be on a passenger flight. These aren't standard tools, an aviation expert explained. These are calibration instruments. Someone with these could make an altimeter read incorrectly, make a pilot think they're higher than they actually are. The tools had been wrapped in cloth, preserved by the cold. When tested in 2024, they yielded a partial fingerprint. After 35 years in ice, most forensic evidence would be useless. But the oil from that single print, protected by the cloth wrapping, survived. It matched James Keller. Digital archaeology. The investigation team employed a technique that didn't exist in 1989, digital archaeology. They reconstructed North Star's entire email system from backup tapes found in a warehouse. What they discovered changed everything. On March 13th at 4:00 p.m., someone had accessed Holloway's computer terminal. Security logs showed Holloway was in a meeting with banks at that time, trying to negotiate an emergency loan. Yet someone used his terminal to send emails about the cash withdrawal. The same pattern appeared with Vasquez's encrypted message. Digital forensics determined the email was composed on her computer but sent through a remote access protocol. Someone with IT privileges had accessed her system remotely. As VP of Operations, Jim Keller had those privileges. He was creating a digital trail, Martinez realized, making it look like Holloway and Vasquez were coordinating something sinister. The promotion that never was investigators contacted former North Star employees, tracking them down across the country. One conversation proved pivotal. Robert Chen, former Senior VP of Development, remembered March 1989 clearly. Keller kept talking about his promotion, said once the Alaska deal closed, he'd finally get Senior VP. But here's the thing, that position didn't exist. I was Senior VP. There was no plan to promote anyone. This lie to his childhood friend revealed something about Keller's state of mind. He was creating justifications, explanations for sudden wealth he expected to receive. Corporate records from 1989 showed something else. Keller wasn't just an employee. Through a complex trust structure established by his late father, Keller owned 12% of North Star Oil. This ownership was hidden, not illegal, but not disclosed to other executives. When Holloway sold the company in 1991, that 12% translated to $8.9 million. But only if the company survived. Only if that insurance payout saved North Star from bankruptcy. The contradiction. As investigators assembled their timeline, a crucial contradiction emerged. Elena Vasquez couldn't have been involved in the physical sabotage. Phone records from March 14, 1989, showed conclusively that Vasquez was on a conference call with attorneys in Seattle from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Alaska time. 47 minutes of billing records confirmed her participation. The call originated from her home landline. She couldn't have been at the terminal during the critical window when the altimeter was tampered with. Vasquez was guilty of fraud, Martinez noted, but she wasn't guilty of causing the crash. This realization shifted the investigation's focus. If Vasquez didn't sabotage the aircraft, her encrypted email about solving the Brennan problem meant something else. Re-examination of her files revealed the full context. The complete message read, "Brennan problem solved after tomorrow's flight when contracts finalize." She was referring to the land deal closing, not to anything sinister. Once the contracts were signed, Brennan's potential discovery of the fraud would be irrelevant. The deal would be done. The storm story. Why did everyone believe the weather caused the crash? The 1989 investigation had accepted it without question. The answer came from an unexpected source. A retired air traffic controller living in Florida contacted investigators after seeing news coverage. "I always wondered about that," he said. The weather report that morning was updated by someone at North Star. They called in a correction, said the storm was worse than predicted. We updated our advisory based on their input. The call had come from North Star's operations desk at 11:45 a.m., after the plane had already crashed. The person who made that call was Jim Keller, already crafting a narrative about weather-related tragedy. The moment of truth. By late April 2024, investigators had assembled their evidence. The financial motives that pointed to Holloway, the legal jeopardy that implicated Vasquez, and the quiet, helpful friend who'd been orchestrating everything from the shadows. Martinez's team found one final piece of evidence in the wreckage, a maintenance log tucked behind the co-pilot's seat. It showed an altimeter adjustment at 6:45 a.m. on March 14th. The signature was smudged but readable. J.K. Emergency Recalibration. Jim Keller had signed his own name to the sabotage. He was probably planning to retrieve that log after the crash, Martinez speculated, create a story about discovering it, maybe blame a mechanic. But the plane ended up 73 miles from where anyone would search. The deviation that Captain Brennan made, flying east instead of west, had preserved the evidence of his friend's betrayal. Detective Martinez sat in the conference room, surrounded by evidence boards that told a 35-year-old story. The team had spent 2 months piecing together fragments, following digital trails, and interviewing anyone who remembered that March morning in 1989. The hardest part wasn't finding evidence, Martinez would later reflect. It was accepting what the evidence revealed, that someone could plan something so calculated, so patient, and hide behind grief for 35 years. The reconstruction began with a simple question. Why did Captain David Brennan fly 73 miles off course? The answer lay in his recovered logbook. At 10:45 a.m., Brennan had made a notation. discrepancy in altimeter reading, backup showing 500 feet variance. He'd discovered the sabotage. Brennan was too experienced to ignore that kind of discrepancy, an aviation expert explained. He would have known something was wrong. The question was what he did about it. The cockpit voice recorder, despite the deliberate damage, had preserved 17 seconds of crucial audio. Enhanced with modern technology, Brennan's voice emerged from the static. Documentation required, heading to Weather Station Alpha. Weather Station Alpha was a remote automated station 73 miles east. It had a landing strip for emergencies and, more importantly, a satellite communication link that couldn't be intercepted. Brennan was trying to report the sabotage. The childhood friend James Keller was arrested on May 15, 2024, at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. He'd retired there in 2001, living comfortably on his millions from the North Star sale. Neighbors described him as friendly, generous, always willing to help. Jim was the perfect neighbor, one resident said. Organized our community watch, helped with fundraisers. You'd never imagine. During interrogation, Keller maintained his innocence for 72 hours. He stuck to his story from 1989. He was the helpful friend, the grieving colleague, the dedicated employee who'd lost everything in that tragedy. But forensic accountants had uncovered something Keller never expected would surface. In February 1989, he'd taken a $500,000 loan from a private lender. The kind of lender who didn't report to credit agencies. The kind who collected debts in ways banks couldn't. Keller was desperate, Martinez explained. He'd hidden his gambling debts for years, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. But by February 1989, he'd run out of options. The $5,000 he'd borrowed from David Brennan on March 7th was just a drop in an ocean of debt. Keller needed a miracle, or $8.9 million from a company sale that would only happen if North Star survived. The unraveling presented with the evidence, the fingerprint on the altimeter tools, the maintenance log with his signature, the 25-minute window only he could explain. Keller's story began to change. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, he finally said. What emerged over the next 12 hours of recorded interviews was a portrait of calculation and betrayal that shocked even experienced investigators. Keller had known about Holloway's financial desperation since January. He'd seen the bankruptcy documents in draft form. He'd calculated exactly what his hidden 12% would be worth if the company failed. Nothing. But he'd also seen the insurance policies. $47 million in coverage if the aircraft and its executives were lost. Enough to save North Star, trigger the land deal, and eventually enable a profitable sale. The plan formed slowly, Keller admitted. I kept thinking there had to be another way, but every path led to the same conclusion. The preparation Keller's confession revealed months of preparation. He'd studied weather patterns, knowing March was storm season. He'd researched altimeter systems, learning exactly how to create a reading that would seem plausible but prove fatal. I needed it to look like weather, he explained. Everyone loses planes to weather in Alaska. He'd arranged for Brennan to be the pilot through careful manipulation, mentioned to executives how reliable David was, suggested the March 14 date, knowing Brennan's schedule, even visited his childhood friend's home to confirm he'd be flying. David trusted me, Keller said, his voice breaking for the first time. That's what I counted on. The $2 million in cash had been Holloway's desperate attempt to close the land deal quickly. Keller had suggested it, knowing cash would make the transaction harder to trace. He'd also known it would provide another motive for investigators to pursue. I needed reasons for people to suspect Holloway and Vasquez, Keller admitted. The money, the fraud, the insurance, it all pointed away from me. The morning of March 14th, Keller's arrival at 6:35 a.m. was carefully planned. He knew the skeleton crew schedule, knew which security cameras had failed months ago and never been repaired, knew he'd have unsupervised access to the aircraft. The altimeter adjustment took 12 minutes. He'd practiced on similar models, knew exactly which components to modify. A 500-foot discrepancy, enough to be fatal in mountain terrain, but subtle enough that a pilot might not notice immediately. "I thought about David finding it," Keller confessed, "but I convinced myself he'd trust the primary instrument. He always followed procedure." But Keller had underestimated his friend's thoroughness. Brennan's habit of cross-checking instruments, developed over 22 years of flying, saved him from immediate disaster, but sealed his fate in another way. The tools went into the canvas bag, meant to be retrieved after the tragedy, when Keller would volunteer to help pack up the hangar. No one would question the grieving friend collecting his belongings. The digital deception. Creating false trails pointing to Holloway and Vasquez required accessing their computer systems. As VP of Operations, Keller had administrative privileges he'd never mentioned to investigators. "I sent emails from their accounts," he admitted. "Made it look like they were planning something. I knew investigators would find them eventually." The encrypted message from Vasquez's computer was deliberately cryptic, designed to seem sinister when discovered. The cash authorization from Holloway's terminal was timed when Keller knew the CEO would be in meetings. "I studied their writing patterns," Keller explained. "Holloway always used that phrase, 'as discussed.' Vasquez wrote in legal shorthand. I made the emails sound like them." But technology in 2024 could detect what 1989 couldn't: the subtle differences in typing patterns, the metadata showing remote access, the digital fingerprints Keller never knew existed. The betrayal revealed. The most chilling part of Keller's confession came when he discussed his actions after the crash. "I was the one who suggested searching south toward the storm. I knew they'd never find anything there." For 2 weeks, while search teams battled weather and terrain, Keller knew exactly where the plane had gone down. He'd calculated the crash site based on the altimeter adjustment and the standard flight path. He was only wrong about one thing: Brennan's decision to fly east. "When they called off the search, I was relieved," Keller admitted. "I thought it was over." The insurance payout proceeded smoothly, with Keller managing much of the paperwork. He comforted Sarah Brennan, helped with funeral arrangements, even spoke at the memorial service about his lost friend. "I told myself David would understand," Keller said. "He'd want his family provided for. The insurance helped Sarah and the kids. That's what I focused on." The long game. For 35 years, Keller lived with his secret. He watched Sarah Brennan remarry, attend her children's graduations, become a grandmother. He sent Christmas cards every year, signed, "Your friend, Jim." When Holloway sold North Star in 1991, Keller collected his $8.9 million quietly. He paid off his debts, invested conservatively, and built a comfortable life. He donated to aviation safety charities, a cruel irony that investigators would later note. "I almost convinced myself it was just a tragic accident," Keller said. "That's how I lived with it." But the discovery of the wreckage in March 2024 shattered that delusion. When news broke about the cash and documents found in the ice, Keller knew technology would reveal what 1989 couldn't detect. "I waited for this knock on my door for 2 months," he admitted. Almost a relief when it finally came. The other suspects, Marcus Holloway, located in Miami, was cleared of involvement in the crash but faced new charges related to financial fraud from 1989. The statute of limitations had expired on most crimes, but investigators found evidence of ongoing tax evasion related to the insurance payout. "I was desperate, not murderous," Holloway insisted. "I would have declared bankruptcy before harming anyone." Elena Vasquez, now a retired law professor in Vermont, was devastated by the revelations. The land fraud she'd facilitated had haunted her for decades, but she'd never suspected the crash was deliberate. "I thought my crimes caused that tragedy indirectly," she said. "The guilt has been unbearable. To learn it was murder, that someone used my wrongdoing as cover, it's almost worse." The indigenous corporation that had been cheated in 1989 finally received justice. Using the recovered documents and Vasquez's cooperation, they won a landmark settlement that included the original $16 million plus 35 years of interest. The final evidence, one piece of evidence, sealed Keller's fate definitively. In the wreckage, investigators found Brennan's personal flight bag. Inside, protected by waterproof casing, was a microcassette recorder. Brennan had been recording his thoughts, a practice Sarah confirmed he'd maintained for years. The final recording, made at 11:15 a.m. on March 14, 1989, was clear. Altimeter's been tampered with. The adjustment signature, it's Jim's handwriting. JK emergency recalibration. God, I can't believe. I'm heading to Station Alpha to report this. If something happens, check the altimeter. Jim Keller did this. 8 minutes later, the aircraft crashed into the unnamed peak. Whether mechanical failure followed the sabotage, whether Keller had done more damage than just the altimeter, or whether the modified instrument finally caused a fatal error, investigators couldn't determine definitively. The mountains kept that secret. The verdict: James Keller was charged with 5 counts of murder, though only 4 bodies were recovered from the wreckage. Captain David Brennan's remains were never found, leading to speculation he might have survived the initial impact and attempted to reach help. But at 8,400 feet in March in Alaska, survival would have been impossible. On September 3, 2024, Keller pleaded guilty to avoid trial. At 79 years old, he was sentenced to life without parole. The federal prosecutor called it one of the most calculated, patient, and cruel crimes in aviation history. He didn't just kill 5 people, the prosecutor stated. He betrayed the deepest trust, used friendship as a weapon, and let families suffer for 35 years not knowing the truth. The legacy: Sarah Brennan, now 81, attended every day of the legal proceedings. When asked for a victim impact statement, she said simply, "David always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was dangerous. He died trying to report a crime, trying to protect others. That's who he was. Jim Keller knew that, counted on it, and used it against him. That's who Jim was." The case changed aviation security protocols. The Brennan Standard now requires dual verification for any maintenance performed within 2 hours of departure. Digital tracking of all personnel accessing aircraft is mandatory. No single person can authorize both financial transfers and flight operations. The unnamed peak where the wreckage was found was officially designated Mount Brennan in October 2024. A memorial plaque reads, "In memory of those who died seeking truth and justice. March 14, 1989. The final mystery. One question remained unanswered. Why did Keller sign his initials on the altimeter adjustment? It seemed like an unnecessary risk, a signature on his own crime. During his final interview, Keller provided an answer that chilled investigators. "I wanted someone to know eventually. Part of me wanted to be caught. Signing it was like leaving a confession. If they'd found the plane in 1989, they'd have known immediately. When years passed and nothing was found, I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore." He paused, then added, "David would have found it during his inspection if I hadn't signed it. He'd have called maintenance, they'd have said no adjustment was scheduled, and he'd have canceled the flight. By signing it, I made it look official. He trusted official. He trusted me." That trust, investigators concluded, was the real weapon, not the altered altimeter or the digital deceptions, but the faith between childhood friends. Keller had counted on Brennan's trust and used it to ensure 5 people would never return from Alaska's wilderness. The investigation closed on November 1, 2024. The final report ran 400 pages, documenting one of the most complex cold cases in aviation history. But at its core, it told a simple story: greed, debt, and betrayal, hidden beneath 35 years of ice and lies. The $2 million found in the wreckage was returned to the Indigenous Corporation, a small justice after decades of wrong. The documents that Captain Brennan had photocopied, his insurance policy, finally served their purpose, not protecting him, but revealing the truth he'd discovered in his final flight. Alaska's mountains had kept their secret for 35 years. In the end, it wasn't advanced technology or brilliant detective work that solved the case. It was the meticulous notes of a careful pilot, the preserved evidence of a desperate gambler's signature, and the patient wait of justice, delayed but not denied. As Detective Martinez noted in her final case summary, some secrets are patient. They wait in ice and time until the world is ready to hear them. David Brennan's truth waited 35 years. It was worth the wait. The charter flight N847BX was officially closed as a case of homicide by sabotage. 5 counts of murder in the first degree. The perpetrator, a friend who smiled at memorial services while millions of dollars filled his accounts. In the aviation community, the case became a cautionary tale, not about mechanical failure or weather or the dangers of Alaska flying, but about the human element. The most dangerous threat to any flight isn't ice or storms or mechanical failure. Sometimes it's the person you trust most.